Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event, Case for Liberty, in which we shall talk about why liberalism is crucial to people's lives, especially in countries where liberties are undermined. I would like to thank everyone who's joined us so far, and obviously say a big thank you to our distinguished speakers who are with us tonight. Unfortunately, Gloria couldn't make it. We're still trying to see if she will join us further on, but until now she hasn't joined us, so we'll just move to Germinal and Carlos. Germinal Van was born in Ivory Coast and is currently a Chicago-based liberal. He's a proponent of neoclassical economics, equal rights, and private ownership, and also a strong advocate for a free market for Africa. Carlos Guimarães Pinto is with us also, and he's the former president of our party, Iniciativa Liberal, and a Portuguese renowned economist, professor, and liberal politician. Bernardo and I will be moderating the discussion. Bernardo is an advisor in Parliament, and I represent the youth in the executive committee of Liberal. So let's get started with the initial remarks. Germano, we start with you about liberalism and Africa.
Yeah, so basically I wrote a book a couple months ago about classical liberalism in Africa because I think it's an important issue that needs to be addressed. And one of the reasons why African economies and their political system is still lagging, it's not because we do not have the people, but it's because the institutions are not strong enough. And one of the strengths of classical liberalism is, of course, the rule of law. And the rule of law is missing in most African countries. There is no legal system that is strongly implemented in which people can rely on to move on with their economic activities. And if there is no rule of law, there can be no economic freedom because the rule of law protects private property. So I wrote this book to address that issue and to explain why it is important for African countries to implement the rule of law as their basic legal framework in order to implement then civil liberties and economic freedom for everybody. And if you look at most African countries, so the countries that have a market-based economy, they are definitely more advanced than countries that used to have a state-planned economy because they have a liberalized market, they rely on free trade. So it helps the income per capita to rise in these countries. So classical liberalism in Africa is also has been seen as a byproduct of from Europe. You know, Africans, they're generally skeptical about liberalism because they believe that it is something that is not within African culture. And the book had simply argued that liberalism, it's a human nature ideology. It's not simply for one specific kind of people. It's for any culture. It is for any society that use it. If we look at Japan, for instance, Japan is a very wealthy country that is not European, that is not Western, and yet Japan is thriving because it relies on the elements of classical liberalism to further its economy, to further its political system, and to expand on civil liberties.
Germinal.
Yeah.
Before I pass to Carlos, I would like to ask you a question. Africa sure. is a continent where I think that socialism is perceived like an anti-colonial and anti-imperial ideology, and capitalism in the other way, it's perceived like the oppression ideology and a culture where individualism is more important than the collective, that is against the culture of the majority of the African countries, I think. So how can the liberals in Africa fight that and change that culture?
So one way to do it is simply to educate people. Instead of fighting against socialism, it's not a lost cause, but it is a battle that will drain us as liberals. is to educate people about the free market, is to educate people about capitalism, how it works, and why it has prevailed for so long. So if we educate people about it in a way of storytelling, people will be more appealed to it rather than using like dry scientific research. I mean, I do that. That's my job. But for the layman, if you want the layman to espouse the ideas of the free market, it will be, of course, better to simply explain to them, you know, to kind of like dumb down, to explain to them in simple language what are the benefits of capitalism, and also to explain some of the issues with capitalism and to make a comparison and show them like, hey, yes, capitalism has its issues, but at the end of the day, when you weigh the two, it has more advantages than flaws, which is true. Every country that has used capitalism and the free market has significantly improved over time. When we look at the post-Soviet countries, that's what exactly happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's simply to explain to people how it is important to understand capitalism, how private property works, and how it is the role of the government to simply protect the rights to private property. Because with private property, we can have economic freedom. If access to private property is restricted, it's hard for people to create wealth and to create growth. So I think that's the path to take in order to make progress in the liberal movement in Africa.
Thank you very much, Germinal. We'll go to you after we hear Carlos. Carlos, on to you about liberalism in Europe, or liberalism in general. You were the former president of Iniciativa Liberal, and you would know about the current situation regarding liberalism in Portugal, for example.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here once again. I'd like to salute Germinal for accepting this challenge of coming and speaking to a Portuguese audience. It's a great honor to have you here, and especially it's a great pleasure for me to speak alongside such talented freedom fighter. I usually speak about the three pillars of freedom: the economic freedom, which includes the freedom to work, to invest, to trade; the social freedom, the freedom to be yourself, to express yourself as you feel like; and the political freedom, which is the freedom to participate, to advocate, to defend your own rights, and of course what you said earlier, which is the independence of state institutions, is very important as well. There is certainly a lot of asymmetry in the world in the degree that these freedoms are taken away in different regions of the world. It's very different, the struggles you have for freedom in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, in China, or in Russia. Someone who fights for freedom in Europe usually will focus a bit more on the economic freedom, because the other two were not so much taken away as the economic freedom. And in many situations, we will be fighting those ones on the left. On the contrary, if you are fighting for freedom in Saudi Arabia, you will not really care so much about economic freedom. It's not really the main priority there. You'll be pretty much focused on individual and political freedoms, usually fighting against conservatives, the local conservatives. So people would almost put you on the left side of politics. And if you are in, I take an extreme example, if you are in Somaliland, which is an extreme example, you will probably not really be concerned about the size of government, but exactly the opposite. You will want to have stronger institutions to ensure property rights, personal freedom, political participation. So in the end, you might actually be doing something that you're not used as a freedom fight, which is to ask for bigger government, which you never do in any developed country. Usually you have the exact opposite problem: excessive government and regulation. But maybe if you fight for freedom in one of those countries, and I gave the extreme example of Somaliland, but throughout Africa, you have that problem in so many other countries. So fighting for freedom in different parts of the world calls for different approach, different tools, and above else also to confront different type of enemies. But one thing that I think we should keep in mind is that while the approaches and enemies might be different, the same principles always apply. So the same amount of courage and a similar goal all the time. I don't know if you're trying to get in, if Germinal, you're trying to get in?
No, I'm fine.
Sorry, I just heard something. So it is, I think it's extremely important to have in mind what your final goal is and the importance of the three freedoms, even though you are focused on one at a time, or you are more focused on one of them. One of the common mistakes of freedom fighters, or people that fight for liberty and freedom, is that they spend so much time fighting the same enemies alongside the same allies that they forget that many of those allies are also enemies of freedom. And they end up siding enthusiastically with other enemies of freedom, even outside what their common struggles are. And the consequences of that can be quite severe. If you fight alongside someone who is an ally, a temporary ally, a momentaneous ally, and because you do that, you just absorb other fights that that ally has, you take the risk of losing credibility in your fight for freedom. Coherence is extremely important, and once you give up one freedom because your momentaneous ally doesn't like it, or you just don't care so much about it, and we have seen that happening a lot. We've seen that with Bolsonaro in Brazil, with Trump in US. That's because there was a common enemy. Some freedom fighters joined that fight, and then they gave up on other types of fights. So it is not easy to avoid the temptations of going along with this type of allies, especially when you are a minority, which usually freedom fighters are, and your momentary ally is much bigger and closer to power. But we shall not forget that the fight for freedom is a long-term and ongoing fight that is never definitely won. We always need to have the reputation and the coherence and the credibility in order to keep on fighting in the long term. Because in order to keep on fighting this war, more important than small short-term wins is long-term consistency. And this is true no matter the fight you are in, no matter which country you are fighting in. Our goal should be always to fight and preserve the three freedoms no matter what. And that was pretty much the message I want to bring in, which is fighting for freedom is very different in very different places in the world. In some places, you might even ask for more government in order to have more freedom. And in other places, you will fight more for economic freedom, or other for individual freedom. But you should never lose the sense of that freedom is not only one freedom; it's a group of freedom that we should always stand for.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I have a question regarding that, because you said the fights for freedom are different in every country. And usually people regard the United States, for example, as a primary example of free markets and liberalism. Would you agree with the statement?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Yes, usually people regard the US, the United States, as the primary example of free market and liberalism. Would you agree?
Definitely. Well, free markets, it was one of the countries that was always at the lead of that. And I'm not sure right now is the country that defends the most the free markets, but still way ahead of Europe and the other developed regions of the world. I believe there are some regions now that start to get ahead. I'll speak about Australia and New Zealand clearly. a bit more friendly towards free markets. But yes, it's not. I would say it's starting to be a problem in US, but Germinal will know that better than me for sure.
Germinal, I already have 2 questions from the public to you. I have more, but I selected 2.
Okay.
And the first one is that if you think that the African continental free trade area, if I think we can compare with the beginning of the European Union, if you think we in Africa, of course, we should advance towards it if it's a good plan.
You mean free trade in Africa?
Yeah, a free, like a European Union in Africa.
Mm-hmm. So Africa already has an African Union, but it is not as solid as the European Union is. That's one of the issues. In fact, the European Union is technically subsidizing the African Union. So when you look at the European Union, it has a political body, an economic body, and even like a social, cultural body. But with the African Union, we do not have that. So it's technically difficult for the African Union to implement some laws that will facilitate free trade among African countries. Because African countries, for instance, trade with European countries and other developed countries, but we barely trade with each other. And if the African Union was an independent organization, like the way the European Union is, that would have definitely helped the free trade system in Africa to thrive. But for now, it's not the case.
Okay. The other one, and I think it's a little bit related, if how you see the Chinese economic initiatives in Africa, how it's if in the first, if you think we can compare with some kind of economic colonialism, and on the other side, what political influence do those initiatives have in the African government?
So yes, it is definitely an economic colonialism for sure, but at the same time, it starts to give some leverages to Africans in the sense that now Africans do not have to rely solely on Europe before making an economic or political decision. China is basically coming in the picture as we are now the new superpower, and we are willing to technically protecting you so long as you also give us some of the stuff that you have that we want. So China is that new player that gives leverage to Africans now. And the influence it has on Africa, though, is that it doesn't necessarily help Africans overall, because Chinese are coming and they're technically doing what Europeans did during the post-independence era. So it's not like it's something new that is changing the outcome. It's just history repeating itself, but with a different society applying the same methods again in Africa.
Okay, thank you. Maria?
Sorry. Thank you, Carlos. What do you think the liberals or libertarians should do? Because you already talked about colliding with the wrong people for the fight for freedom. But regarding socialism and socialist countries, why do you think people always prefer the socialist mentality? Do you think it's put in their minds, or do you think there's a way out, or what could we do to fight this?
I think it's because people see it as a very easy solution, and it's much easier to explain socialism to people than classical liberalism. It's much easier. It's much more intuitive, and people all over the world will tend to do that. And worst of all, the poor and less educated people are, the harder it will be to change. So it's a vicious cycle that we have here, that that the poorer the country, the more difficult it is to explain the advantage of classical liberalism, and the poorer it gets, etc., etc., etc. But we, those ones who fight for freedom, for liberties, should use the fact that it really works everywhere. Sometimes people speak about there are some cultural constraints, that maybe this system is not the right one. And no matter where we have seen free markets and individual freedom applies, and there's a good example in Africa even. Germinal probably can speak about it, which is Rwanda. Rwanda was coming out of a bloody war, a country that was completely destroyed in a continent that is not very friendly towards classical liberalism, that doesn't have very strong institutions such as Africa. So it was a country that clearly had no conditions. Anyone would say no way that liberalism will prevail there, but they did those reforms. They did the institutional reforms, the economic reforms, the social reforms, and it was a country that thrived. And it's fantastic in the middle of, in a region where no other country could do that, with no special, or at least not more than its neighbors in terms of natural resources. And we see this being repeated over whichever the continent, whatever culture we can speak about, it works everywhere. It works in Rwanda as it works in Southeast Asia, as in Oceania, as in Latin America. I'm sorry that Gloria is not here, that she will clearly confirm this. Wherever there are reforms and that lead towards a more a freer market, more individual freedoms, stronger institutions, and more political freedom, the country thrives, people thrive, and that works everywhere. So that's the message that we should keep on passing to everyone in any part of the world. No, you are not condemned to be what you are. You're not condemned to be poor. You are not going to be poor for the rest of our history. It's colonialism that happened years ago will not. It's not something that will definitely condemn you to be poor. It doesn't matter. I mean, if we think about this, look at the 50s. In the 50s, Ivory Coast and South Korea had the same GDP per capita. We are speaking about two countries that nowadays have a really wide difference in terms of economic development, but they had the same starting point. What was the difference there? It was not colonialism, because they all faced this type of problems. It was not the starting point of being poor. It was not the starting point of low education. It was the political choice they made towards more freedom, more economic freedom, more political freedom, and stronger institutions. So it can work anywhere. It's just a question of making that choice, and that's what we should try to tell people. It's our choice. We can do it. We are not constrained by anything, by cultural links. We're not constrained by our starting point. We can do it. Well, repeating the slogan, yes, we can do it.
Thank you. Bernardo?
Yeah, Germinal, I have another question that is related to what Carlos said about some African countries like Rwanda. I know that you have an article about the development of Rwanda and about property rights. So if you could explain a little bit the relative success, economic success of the country, and
Sure.
also we know
Sure,
that
yes.
countries just another one related also. We know that countries like Botswana and Ghana, on one side, had a great development, but countries like Tanzania that were really rich, they implemented socialist policies, and the economy went like bankruptcy. So if you could explain a little bit the success of these countries compared with Tanzania.
Sure. Okay. So let's start with Rwanda. So Carlos pointed out that Rwanda had a bloody genocide indeed. And they had that for, I think, 3
Germinal
or 4 years. And after the genocide, Kagame
Yeah,
Rwanda for quite a while.
we're having
Although
trouble
it
hearing
is
you.
that-
I think
Yes, can you hear me?
the first part of
Hello?
what you said, I think we didn't quite understand it. If you...
Okay. I will definitely restart it. So I was saying that to point out what Carlos said, Rwanda started with a genocide, a bloody genocide. Everything was destroyed. There was no infrastructures, nothing. And in 1997, after the genocide, Kagame became president, and he's still the president up to now. Yes, Kagame is an authoritarian leader. There is no political freedom in Rwanda. But Kagame loosened the economic freedom. He loosened access to property rights. That is why the economy of Rwanda began to soar, because more Rwandans have access to private property. They can create new businesses and they can employ more people. The economy always starts with human beings. No matter where we are, if people are not employed, if they're not using the skills to create economic value, there can be no economic growth. That's what happened in Rwanda. Yes, their people cannot vote for a leader. There is no political democracy in Rwanda, but there is economic freedom in Rwanda. And Milton Friedman always used to say that you need economic freedom first before having political freedom, because the economic freedom will inevitably lead to political freedom. That's what happened in Chile with Pinochet. So when we look at now Ghana, Ghana at first started with, it started as a socialist country too, with Kwame Nkrumah. But what happened was that when Nkrumah was president, although he had a great vision for Ghana, the problem was his policies. The policies that he implemented stagnated the Ghanaian economy. And it was the same that Julius Nyerere did in Tanzania. They all had that great vision. Like, they were Pan-Africanist leaders. They want the freedom for Africans. They want Africans to be completely independent. But the minute those countries became independent, they start to nationalize all the major industries. And the nationalization of those industries stagnated the economy, because the leaders were not able to efficiently allocate resources as if the entrepreneurs would do. That was the main issue. That was the reason why, when you look at South Korea or Ivory Coast and Tanzania, when you look at the GDP in the 50s and look at the GDP now, South Korea completely opened its economy to everyone. That is why its GDP soared considerably compared to most of African countries. Their GDP soared eventually, but it took more time because some decide to become more socialist than others. So that is basically the main reason. And access to property right is still an issue in most African countries. So long as leaders will continue to restrict access to property rights, those countries cannot have an economic growth based on the long term. It could be, they could have economic growth, but it will be short. It will be it will be like a short economic growth. It will not last. So for us to have a sustainable economic growth, people need to have access to private property. They need to have to create more businesses, because the creation of more businesses will create more employment and it will lift more people out of poverty.
Am I allowed to make a question? I'm actually curious. You mind if I intervene?
Yeah, for sure.
Germinal. Just one thing. I worked for a very long time in Africa. I just know the Africa from the business perspective. And one of the things that I got quite impressed or badly impressed was how endemic corruption is in pretty much every country. I've been in West and East Africa, and pretty much every country, it's almost accepted as normal, right? No one really even questions it anymore. How do you think they can get out of that? Because it's almost a way of life nowadays. I mean, policemen
No, you're right. No, it's true.
get money. They just get the bribes.
It's the problem is that African culture, it's kind of like the Soviet economy. You know, you remember the Soviet economy was based on a command style economy, so it was top down. That's how African society is. Everything starts from the top. But if people at the top are not willing to put the law above them,
yeah, it's
basically that
has become a very extractivist society, right? It looks more where people looking where they can extract something instead of producing a.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The problem with African society, it's a rent-seeking society. I'm sure you heard about the rent-seeking concept of Gordon Tullock. Yeah, like it's people get into the political realm to expand their personal wealth instead of creating new wealth for the general population. That's the issue. However, though, this tendency started to change slowly, but corruption remains a relevant yet predicamental factor in African societies. But a country like Ivory Coast, for instance, it's one of the most liberal country in, economically speaking. In Ivory Coast, you can open a business and you can thrive there. I know personally some friends that used to live in Europe, and life was tough for them in Europe, so they decided to go back home and to open a business, and they're thriving economically. And the policies of the current president attracts people to invest in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast is the fourth country in Africa to do business.
Oh, wow.
Because property rights there, because access to property rights there is working. It's in progress. I'm not saying that it is perfect, of course, but you have more security having assets and property there than, for instance, in Nigeria. I've made a study where I was comparing the access to private property in the four major powers of West Africa and Nigeria, although it is the most powerful country in West Africa and in the whole continent, has the lowest access to private property, which is a big contradiction because of because the legal and political environment that is supposed to protect private property doesn't do its job because of corruption.
Yeah, it's very fun that you speak about private property. I had a funny moment. I worked in Nigeria at some point with a telecom company, and they wanted to roll out networks. So put more antennas all over. And well, there is a rule book for that in every country in the world, which is you have to choose a spot and see who owns that spot, and then ask permission to put it. And they were telling me they never do that because there's no official registry of most of the land. So they just go and put there the tower and wait for someone to claim it. If no one claims it, then they have it for free. Otherwise, they just leave it there. But I think you touched a point that it's very important about the rent-seeking in society. And I think Europe, the EU policy regarding Africa also helps that, because we still see Africa as mostly a destination of subsidies and external support, not really a trade partner. Actually, the main product where Africa could be competitive, we still reject it in Europe, which is agriculture. We still close completely our markets to African agricultural products, which would be the first step towards a more developed continent, because it's where Africa would have a very good competitive advantage. But we refuse it. Instead, we just give subsidies. Worse than that, sometimes we just give for free agricultural products which destroy the local markets, because then they cannot sell their own produce.
The reason why Europeans never seen Africans as an equal partners is because Africans do not transform their own raw materials. Because the way Europeans see Africans, they don't do that with the Chinese. They know better. China right now is the most industrialized nation on the planet. Even the United States cannot compete with China right now in terms of continuous industrialization. China right now is beating everybody. But us, we have all the natural resources the planet ever gave to us. We have everything. We have the commodities, we have the rivers, we have all the subsoil assets, the minerals, and yet we do not have the factories to transform these natural resources. And that is the fundamental problem with an economy. If you base your economy on natural resources, you're going to have a stagnated economy eventually. Yeah. When you look at China, when you look at Japan, when you look at Singapore, these countries have barely natural resources. Japan has been bombed twice, and yet they are one of the most powerful nations in Asia. Why? Because the Japanese focus on education. Yeah. The literacy rate is one of the highest. In China, 96% of the people know how to read, write, count, and they're literate in computer science as well. In Africa, most countries have a literacy rate which is less than 60%. There is a problem.
Yeah. Do you think size is also a problem? Because if we look at the whole sub-Saharan Africa, the whole sub-Saharan Africa is, the economy, it's the same size as Netherlands. I think it's even smaller than Netherlands. Do you think the size is an issue, a challenge as well? And how could they overcome that challenge? Like the African Union would be a way to do that, but only if it has some type of political union as well, which is not.
But Carlos, the African Union is subsidized by the European Union. The African Union, no, it's true. The African Union is not independent.
That's true. That's true.
It is not. So, and Africans do not trade with each other. Whatever product they have, they extract from their natural resources. They ship it straight to developed countries. African countries, for instance, Burkina Faso doesn't trade with Mali. Whatever Burkina Faso produce, they ship it, they send it first to Ivory Coast because we are the transitory country that ship the products for them, into the rest of the world. So they ship it straight to the rest of the world. They don't trade with Mali, or Niger doesn't trade with Togo, etc. And the Ghanaian president, Nana Akufo, said that. He said, Africans need to embrace free trade. If we do not trade with each other, we are still going to be at the same level. We will have all these natural resources at our disposal, and we will not be able to transform them. Asia has nothing, but yet they transform everything.
That's true.
While Africa has everything but transforms nothing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Germinal, because I was going to ask Carlos actually about the European Union, because you were saying that one of the major criteria for market is that free market exists, right? So I was going to ask Carlos if we know that the free market is one of the essential things for libertarian policies to evolve and to act, but what about the European Union? Because it allowed many countries to trade between each other. That's right. And actually, it installed a quality democracy institutions. For example, in Eastern Europe, we see in the 90s that Hungary, for example, turned to democracy, and alongside dramatic market reforms in Poland. But it was initially a force for good, but now we see that the mere existence of these institutions doesn't mean anything. So doesn't mean they yield true power, right? And my question is also related to the centralization of policies in the European Union, because it leaves space for corruption. So is the European good for the liberalization of countries like Portugal, because of free market, etc., or is it actually stopping and preventing countries from achieving liberal policies?
I very often criticize European Union. I think I'm against a very strong political union. I think it should be a union of nation states. But much of that speech, I think, right now is very exaggerated. I think the European Union has very limited power still over the nation states. It still respects quite a lot the sovereignty of nation states. We are not to that point where we could say, yes, European Union has done more harm than good. I think we are very far from that, especially for the poorest countries. I think European Union was crucial to the growth of the Central and Eastern European countries, the former bloc, East Bloc. I think they were crucial. And I even risk to say another thing, which is it was crucial to the development and maintenance of democratic institutions in Southern European countries. I'm not sure, and I'm stating the very dangerous, I'm taking a very dangerous path. I'm not sure we would have a strong enough democracy in Portugal, Spain, and Greece if it wasn't for the European Union. And we have seen in the past that there was always in these countries some deviations away from democracy, away from strong institutions, which we don't have yet. Especially Portugal and Greece do not have very strong political and democratic institutions. We do not have them, and if it wasn't for European Union, we might have lost completely some of these pillars of freedom. So I think, especially in Southern Europe, we tend to thank the European Union just for the subsidies, for the money that they send over. But the thing that we have to thank them the most is to keep not strong, but to keep some political institutions that are extremely important for democracy. Of course, different parts of Europe have different things to thank. Eastern Europe right now has a lot to thank because of the economic freedom. The free trade brought them a boost of economic growth that it would be unimaginable to think that they would have 20 years ago. They had a miracle because they followed a lot the liberal policies. They opened up the markets, but the fact that they could be in a large market helped them a lot to get that boost of economic growth. And that's why I was asking Germinal about Africa, if having something closer to an European Union that would give them a critical dimension to grow, to trade between themselves would be ideal or not, because it was crucial for Europe. I'm sure right now we have a lot more democracies and economic growth in Europe because European Union is there, with all its problems, with a lot of flaws, with the excessive bureaucracy, whatever. But if it wasn't for the European Union, I'm sure that those countries with weaker institutions and those countries that were smaller and underdeveloped because they belong to the East Bloc, they wouldn't have such strong democracy and such strong economic growth as they have.
I agree. Germinal, for the ones that don't know, you live in Chicago in the US and you have political participation there, and I would like to if you don't mind, to change from Africa to America, and
Sure.
ask you how you see the current political scenario. I know that you have some libertarian interventions in politics there, and how you see the current administration also.
How can I start this? So the current political climate in the United States is a mess. It is a mess because, first of all, with coronavirus going on,
Yeah.
The policies that the government implemented, they have a ground, but the government overreached its powers. You know, yes, the government was able to contain the spread of the virus. When we look at the statistics, we see that the spread significantly diminished. At the same time too, the government saw that saw that situation as a boon to inflate its own power, its own authority by using coercion on people. There were some states that if you do not wear a mask, or if you're not in your own home, like you can have a fine or even be jailed for it. So there was a sort of like totalitarianism in the air. And now there is, I don't know if you saw what happened lately here with the killing of George Floyd. There's kind of like, I would not say like it's a race war, but there is like huge protests all around the country. And the federal government doesn't really know how to address that issue. They send the National Guards in Minneapolis, but protests are still going on all across the country. The elections are coming in November. It looks more likely like Trump might get reelected. Joe Biden is not doing really great, to be honest. The guy lost his mind. He can barely remember things, so it's not looking good for the Democratic Party. But to be honest though, like what's going on here is that the government is way too big. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in power, right now it's a war between the state versus the people. That's what is going on, and the freedom of the people are being restricted more and more, and the state is overreaching its power on a daily basis. So I'm not surprised if eventually they will start like suppressing our freedom, because that's what is going on. It's something that is being done progressively. So the best way to curb that issue will be to apply localism, to apply the decentralization of political power, give sovereignty to local communities to decide for themselves what is good for themselves. Mm-hmm. But today we are culturally dependent on the federal government. For any reason, we believe that the federal government will fix the issue for us, but the federal government actually makes it worse. And the government has more powers, and the life of the people do not improve. So we see that there's a paradox. So I think localism and decentralizations will truly help local communities to become more independent and sovereign.
Carlos is a strong advocate of decentralization here in Portugal.
I mean, Carlos too. I mean, we need centralization is key. You have to decentralize. Yeah. Centralization never helps. You centralize, you just misallocate things because you're one place and you try to decide for the person who lives, I don't know, like 10,000 miles away from you, what is best for him. Like, you don't know that. You're not there to see what's going on. And yet you decide what is best. It doesn't make sense.
We have an example of that nowadays with the coronavirus, because Portugal is a small country, of course, but we have regions of Portugal where there is like no case, and others where there are a lot of cases, and we have the same rules, the same restrictions
Yeah,
for
it's
every region.
and it is the
makes no
same in
sense.
Illinois. It is the same in Illinois. Like Illinois, for instance, there is the main important part of Illinois, to be honest, is Chicago.
Yeah.
The economy of Illinois is centralized in Chicago. Chicago had more cases than the entire state of Illinois. Chicago has like probably over 60,000 cases, while the rest of the state had probably less than 10,000. But
Yeah.
they implement the same rules for the rest of the state.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Do you want to comment, Carlos?
I completely agree, and I think one of the biggest. I changed my background because someone in the comments was complaining about how small my bookshelf was. I hope now they are happy with this. I think Maria was speaking about the problems of European Union, and one of the challenges that we might actually have is that more and more decisions will be centralized, and that's quite a big risk. And US, for me, it's a good example there. It's probably not ideal, but compared with Europe, it's a very decentralized power that goes almost to the level of county. While in in Europe we are going the opposite direction, which is more and more powers towards the center of European Union. Within nation states, more and more power concentrated at national level, and that's quite a risk because no one knows better what to do than what the people that have the feeling of what is happening in the local population. And as Bernardo said, the recent example of coronavirus, at least in Portugal, was fantastic. The national government was still running around like a headless chicken, and the local authorities were already taking care, testing people and knowing exactly what was the problem. You know, we had a huge problem with old people's homes. It was not only in Portugal, in many places, but in Portugal it was especially severe. And the national government, the national authorities were still saying you should go and visit your elders. You should go and visit them. Don't stop from visiting. And the local authorities were already saying the opposite. Please don't do that at this point. Please, let's test them. Let's understand what is happening. Why? Because if you are closer, you know better what happens. So of course, there's a bunch of things you cannot do locally. Yes, you need some critical dimension to do. That's fine. That should be in the national government. But there's really most of the things. If you think about education, healthcare, and even local policy, it should be done at the local level, and it's done more efficiently if it's done at the local level. If you look into the countries of Europe, the ones that are known to manage better the tax revenues are the ones that are more decentralized, which we just speak about the Nordic countries, whatever. Yes, they have higher tax revenue, but it's better used. Why? Because most of it is used at the local level, not at the national level.
We are reaching the end. I would like to thank you, but before that, Germinal, do you have any final message for the Portuguese fans that you have?
No, honestly, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity you guys gave me. It's I did not see that coming at first, so it's a great opportunity to give me exposure in Portugal. So thank you guys for that. I want to tell everyone that believe in libertarian ideologies and classical liberalism, generally speaking, to keep fighting, to keep educating others who may have some sympathy for classical liberalism, but they don't know much about it. It's our role to educate them about it, to explain to them how it works and how it helps and improves humanity as a whole, because they're overwhelming evidence to prove that. So let's keep fighting for liberty. It's a long fight ahead of us. As Carlos said, like people are leaning more towards socialism because it's more intuitive. You know, it sounds good. It appeals to emotions, and so people tend more to believe in socialism. But our role is to tell people that no, like your true development is not within a society that is centralized by a central authority. Your true development is within your local community, you know, where things can be done efficiently and more and steadier. So let's keep fighting for liberty, whether we're in the United States, in Portugal, or in the rest of Europe, and in Africa. Let's keep promoting liberty the best we can, and I believe that one day it will pay off.
Thank you. Carlos, any final message?
Yeah, I'll just like to thank Germinal. So it's really, really, really nice to have this discussion with him. I've been following you for quite some time now, and it was really great to finally be able to talk to you sort of in person now in the pandemic way of talking in person. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. I hope we will have the opportunity to have further discussions in the future. And thank you, Bernardo, Maria, and Philippe, of course, for organizing this. It was really, really good to be here again.
Thank you. Before we finish this, I would just like to say again that Gloria unfortunately couldn't make it. We don't know what happened. She couldn't join the meeting, so we couldn't count on her remarks as well. I think it would have been very interesting, but Germinal and Carlos, I think they did an amazing job. Germinal, you just gained thousands of Portuguese fans, right?
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also to the people who were watching us and were commenting on why we weren't speaking Portuguese, I think it should be self-evident, right? So Germinal can't speak Portuguese. We have to.
No, unfortunately.
Yeah, we have to adapt. I think now that he has so many fans, maybe you learn how to say a few words. But guys, sorry, we had to do this in English, of course, because it would be ungrateful even to speak in Portuguese during this event. So thank you very much to Carlos.
Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.